Cornell West.
This is Chris Hedges.
I'm Rosa Clemente.
Hey, what's up? This is Chuck D, Public Enemy, Prophets of Rage.
And this is Newsbeat.
Technically, it's This Week in Social Justice, presented by Newsbeat, but semantics, right? It's your man, Manny Faces, live and direct from sunny Brick City, New Jersey, speaking to my brethren scattered throughout the globe in secret undisclosed bunker locations. Mr. Rashed Mian, managing editor of both Newsbeat and This Week in Social Justice, and Christopher T. Like Mr. T.
You finally pronounced my last name correctly.
I've been trying a number of years, but now that you've legally changed it to T to stop all the confusion, that's helpful. Chris,
so you both have legally changed your names except for me. I guess I'm next.
You are next. You are next, and I'd like to hear by the end of the show.
Recommendations?
Shetty
are welcome.
Shetty. We talked about that.
We did.
It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
Yeah. Rashed, what your mama gave you. There's a lot of options.
Well, I got Rasheed Wallace all throughout high school, so
that's true. You know that might work, and you might actually get. It's like it's. I was gonna speak about a similarity of my government name with a famous baseball player, but I won't because then it gives away. It'll kill the allure, the mystique of my fake name. Anyway, so Chris is also the editor-in-chief of Newsbeat and the editor-in-chief of This Week in Social Justice. I'm giving people time to trickle in. We have such a short lead up into the show that we do visually with on the social networks every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern. But then we take the audio, we throw it on the podcast feed. So you might be listening to us on the podcast feed. Peace and love to you. We're also doing this live video show This Week in Social Justice. It's actually live and video on our social networks every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Or if you're watching us maybe on the replay on one of our networks, Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, etc., realize that we're also actually podcasters, and we have a very good social justice oriented podcast called Newsbeat. So there's a cross-pollination happening here every week. And I say that to introduce ourselves, give some people time to trickle in. I'm going to have a segment at the beginning, what bothers Manny this week, so that we can kill some time. It's very, very important.
That wasn't in the script. That was not in the script, though.
No, I'm not going to do it right now. I mean, I was thinking about like the shouts to Kitty Bradshaw in the building. Yes, indeed. Superstar out there in those Twitch streets. I was going to today I was pondering the over dramatization of the fact that an old lady swallowed a fly. So we assume that she's going to die.
And this probably took up a good part of your afternoon.
Right, because then she eats all the other things to kill the fly, the spider to catch the fly. But when you first start the song, all she's done is swallow the fly. You can't predict the course of events that's going to lead to her swallowing a horse. And yes, at some point, her stomach will burst, her innards will, explode. So, but in the beginning, you assume she's going to die simply from swallowing the fly.
Is this the same? Is this related to the Christmas book where the old lady swallows a bell?
I don't know. I don't know what Christmas book that is
for toddlers. Come on, guys. Come on.
So I've had quite a few toddlers, and I don't know about that one. We will research this and get back to you. Obviously, everyone is going to want to know about it. In the meantime, in between time, now that Kitty Bradshaw is here, all is well in the world. This is This Week in Social Justice, presented by the Newsbeat podcast crew, streaming live Wednesdays at 8 p.m. We do have special guests this evening, a very guest-packed show, actually, more guests than we thought, more topics than we thought. So we're going to keep moving. This show brings you certain things that are happening in the world of social justice that you might not see on your cable news networks because they're engrossed in, very top level national flashy stuff that you hear over and over again. So we bring you some of the inside baseball, as it were. Super important. Two guests tonight. Who's setting them up? I don't even know.
So first up, we have Emily Widra, research analyst at Prison Policy Initiative, who just co-wrote a report, basically showing just how dismal the rollout of vaccines within jails and prisons has been. And that's a subject, obviously, we've been covering. Emily was also on a previous episode about that topic. Mm-hmm. So we're really happy to have her.
Shouts to her for coming on and breaking it down for us. Obviously, the but we'll talk about it. But we were very early on the issue of how the prison population was going to be affected by COVID-19, and we were right, and we were early, and we don't want to be right about things like that, but we are. Next up.
Yeah, stick around for the second half of the show because we're going to have Daniel Nichanian, and he's the founder and editorial director of The Appeal Political Report. Anybody who follows criminal justice and social justice issues, you're probably familiar with The Appeal. They do a lot of great work covering these issues. And Daniel's going to be on to talk about Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner's decisive victory last night in his re-election bid to remain DA in Philly. So definitely check that out because it has a lot of local and national importance.
Right on. That was the Philadelphia District Attorney primary, right? Is that last night? The primary?
No, it's just the it was the primary, and it's showing the sort of the, even among Democrats, which Krasner is, there's still this tough on crime aspect to it, and the police unions backed the opposition, his opponent. So there's definitely a lot of things in there with social justice issues, racial justice. So we'll get into that with Daniel.
Good. I always enjoy that topic because I always think it's really important how much we should pay attention to the fact that district attorneys, the idea of a progressive district attorney, can make a lot of changes in the criminal justice system. We talk about criminal justice reform. We often look at the president to do some things, or the senators, and they're all cuckoo birds for the most part. Maybe not numerically, but probably numerically, they're all cuckoo birds. Probably like statistically, but they can't make often as much change as a local DA can, and we vote for our local DAs in a lot of cases. So it's a super important topic. I'm glad we're talking about it. That being said, again, thanks to Kitty Bradshaw for tuning in. We do have some interesting stuff. Kitty, you're gonna learn some things, and you'll probably be horrified. We're also going to talk about UFOs. So there's that. Dead ass UFOs. It's common. It's important. You don't want to miss it. For now, our news beat bites. Yeah. So I'm starting, and I'm well prepared this time because I live in Newark, New Jersey, which is the largest city in New Jersey, the largest city in New Jersey, Newark. It has become the first city, latest city, but probably the first in New Jersey, to launch the Universal Basic Income Program. There is our esteemed Mayor Ras Baraka.
Ras Baraka is the mayor of Newark, New Jersey's largest city.
Many faces, like the many-faced God in the building.
Okay.
That was incredible. Right out the gate.
I live in Newark, New Jersey, and of course, I'm one of my.
This guy does not miss an opportunity. Does not miss a single opportunity.
As a DJ, so shouts to Ras Baraka, our honorable mayor. As you can see, city officials on Monday launched a 2-year pilot program, which will eventually provide cash payments to some 400 low-income residents, making New Jersey's largest city the latest place to embrace guaranteed income as a way to bridge the wealth gap. Mayor Baraka said, "We want to show the world that we give our residents freedom of choice and recognize and affirm that inherent dignity. They will make decisions that will help us to build a stronger and more resilient city." I've been in Newark for about 4 years. I've been very impressed with how they are working to bring the city to the sort of forefront of the idea of some progressive values, social justice work, police reform, and of course now universal basic income. Your thoughts, gentlemen? I know we've been talking about this issue behind the scenes, obviously, for a while. What does this mean for the city and for the larger issue?
I mean, I think in the few municipalities that have done this, I believe that the statistics show just how beneficial it is.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that it shows more people ended up getting jobs because they have money for transportation.
Yeah.
They have money for sitters to watch their children. So it's fantastic.
All right. Shouts to Mayor Baraka for that initiative, and we'll follow up more to see if that's how that affects things out here in Newark, New Jersey. Once again, let me remind you that
Ras Baraka is the mayor of Newark, New Jersey's largest city.
Many faces, like the many-faced God in the building.
much less
Unbelievable.
comical is this issue, Rashad. This is your news bite. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick because we got Emily coming up. But I just wanted to call attention to something that's happening in the United States as we observe, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and that's the solidarity and this sort of growing movement connecting Black Lives Matter and racial justice protesters with Palestinians here and Palestinians abroad. There's been a long history of solidarity between the two groups in the U.S. and Palestine. Sometimes you'll see murals of people killed by police in the United States, in Palestine. So this has been happening for a long time. And we've also seen a lot of protests in recent days throughout American cities, advocating for justice for Palestinians. So as you're following this story, I just wanted to call attention to sort of the solidarity between the two groups. And we'll see where that takes us. Obviously, we've seen the racial justice protests had a lot of impact last summer and into this year in terms of some police reform. So we'll see what happens now.
Very interesting connection there. I think we're going to delve into it a little bit more. And so we have a clip. Or we're going to not do the clip?
Oh, yeah. Oh, if we have time. I don't know if we have time because of Emily, but Cori Bush.
Oh, right there. Go ahead.
Congresswoman Cori Bush had a impassioned speech on the floor, and I think it starts at 2:09. Manny, and if you could click, it's about a minute long.
All right, let's go.
Be here to save lives. Bassem's loved ones and his community, our St. Louis community, sent me here to save lives. So that means we oppose our money going to fund militarized policing, occupation, and systems of violent oppression and trauma. We are anti-war, we are anti-occupation, and we are anti-apartheid, period. If this body is looking for something productive to do with $3 million, instead of funding a military that polices and kills Palestinians, I have some communities in St. Louis City and in St. Louis County where that money can go, where we desperately need investment, where we are hurting, where we need help. Let us prioritize funding there. Prioritize funding life, not destruction. So today we remember Bassem. We remember his resistance in the face of militarized police occupation as a St. Louisan and a Palestinian. We lost him to a health crisis, but we remember his words today. Until all our children are safe, we will continue to fight for our rights in Palestine and in Ferguson. We stand with you in solidarity. St. Louis.
So yes, again, a great topic, a really interesting connection there. We're going to delve into this a little bit more, but as you all know who are watching live and following up, we're putting the links to the stories that we're talking about in the comment section. Check them out, follow up, understand that there's an interesting connection there that ties into a lot of the issues that we talk about on a regular basis. So we'll come back to that. Christopher, on to you, sir.
Yes, real quick. I just wanted to call attention to an investigation that The Guardian just published. And as in our last show, Rashad had mentioned how, after George Floyd had died, the Minneapolis Police Department published a short press release titled, quote, "Man dies after medical incident during police interaction." Obviously, we know what happened. It had no mention, obviously, of the knee that was on his neck for over 9 minutes.
Sure.
Or any of the other torture. And so basically this investigation, though, took a look at other cases focusing on California, and they found more than a dozen with very similar traits where, unfortunately, just taking one of them, 23-year-old named Juan Armstrong died in Santa Rita jail back in 2018, and the sheriff reported it as a drug overdose. There were no drugs. It made no mention of what the autopsy report found, which was that prior to his death from asphyxiation, he was strapped to one of these bodysuits that basically pressed him like a pretzel, and then put a spit mask over him, and that's how he died. So it goes on and on. It's just an incredible. I mean, it's obviously incredibly disturbing, but it's really important for a light to be shown on this, not just to hold the police accountable, for these deaths and for accurately reflecting what happens during these confrontations, but also for journalists. There's another case in there where there was an altercation at a family barbecue between a 20-year-old and a 16-year-old, and the police showed up and just started firing, and they killed the 20-year-old and told the media that it was a man trying to kill a minor with a knife. And once the dust, sort of clears, there was no knife. There was no knife. But this person is forever crucified throughout all different types of media outlets as a knife-wielding maniac who was trying to kill a kid. So, the lesson for journalists obviously is you don't take what is fed to you, and you question things and you investigate. And when there's a mistake, you correct it. So we're going to share that link. And then real quick, the second thing is sort of a follow-up, and we want to try to keep pressure on the U.S. museum system. We did a piece last show, horrific story, but it's tied to, in 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb, 1 to 2 bombs on top of a house, incinerating 11 people alive. 5 were children, and they were all activists of a group called MOVE. Just recently, it turned out that the bones of a 12-year-old who was burned alive by the police ended up being used as a teaching prop in some Ivy League schools. And this is the most recent fallout. On the anniversary of the bombing, which was last Wednesday, May 13th, the mayor came out and admitted that he stated to everyone that he had just found out that the health commissioner had taken other family members' bones, and instead of returning them to the family members for either burial or just for them to have, he decided to just incinerate them himself. So he told an underling to toss it into the incinerator. And so now he stepped down. And just in recent days, it's still evolving, but now they're saying they might have found another box with some people's remains in it. They don't know who it is, and so they're going to try to maybe give that back. So, we're going to stay on top of the story. And as we learned from that show, there are over 500,000 bones and other remains of Native folks within the U.S. museum system. There's tens of thousands of body parts, including thousands upon thousands of skulls of Black and brown folks, and many of them formerly enslaved. So it's just horrific stuff. But we need to continue to talk about it to keep the pressure on. So.
Absolutely. And those who are interested in that but didn't see our other show, please do go back in the archives. We talked about this in depth. We had great conversation, great guests about the entire situation, and we plan on having more. So stay tuned. We're following this story. It's a really horrific thing. And also, I sense a pattern here that when we hear something horrific like that it's a pattern here. You know what I mean? That it's something that's been happening when we talk about, the lies that they put out in the police report about what happened to this, gentleman who suffered a medical snafu and, unfortunately perished. And you find out that that's really just a plain old cover up for actions that they took. There's a pattern there. So, what I like, again, brings it all full circle to the fact that local DAs play an instrumental part of making sure that these things don't happen, because as we see with the latest ongoing string of police-involved killings of young Black men, that DAs feel like the police are justified in their actions. So there's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, and just one last quick note on that. And obviously, not every police officer is a mass murderer like some of these people.
Sure.
But it also speaks to, the police being used to respond to what a health, officer should probably respond to. I mean, a lot of mental health, undiagnosed mental health and diagnosed mental health issues. And we've talked about this on previous shows too, so you can go back and listen to some of that.
It's almost like solutions exist. Oh my God, so weird. Anyway, let's keep it going, y'all. This week is social justice, resetting the room as we do on Clubhouse. By the way, are we going to do Clubhouse tomorrow? If we're around, we'll do a follow-up to this on Clubhouse. If you do follow us on Clubhouse, follow me on Clubhouse. We'll do a follow-up to this show, kind of like a post-game report, 1 o'clock Eastern. Check us out. Moving along, we want to welcome our phenomenal guest. Let's go.
All right. We're lucky to have on Emily Widra of the Policy Prison Initiative for tonight's show to talk about vaccines inside jails and prisons. Emily, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Glad to be here.
So we're going to point everybody to your new report that I think was released today. And I know that's when it landed in my inbox. But Emily, can you just remind the audience about some of the conditions inside jails and prisons during the COVID-19 pandemic and the infections compared to the general population? I just want to sort of lay out some context for people if they don't recall what's been happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the two most pressing statistics to think about when we're talking about COVID behind bars is that the case rate is almost 4 to 5 times higher in prisons than it is in the general US population. So we're talking about more than double, like 4 to 5 times higher. That's huge. And the same thing is true of the mortality rate from COVID. So people in prisons are dying at 2 to 3 times higher rate than those who are outside of prison. So we're seeing sort of the effects of COVID that we are experiencing in the outside happening sort of in a microcosm under a magnifying glass, amplified in prisons and jails. So, you know, that's been happening obviously since the beginning of last year. There's been, you know, over 400,000 cases in prisons. There have also been over 100,000 cases among prison staff and a couple hundred deaths of staff. So this is kind of something that's definitely still running rampant in prisons and jails across the country and has been pretty catastrophic behind bars.
It's horrifying. And later on, we're going to play a part of the episode that you helped us out with, Emily, in the past about this. I'm wondering, so you went through some of these statistics that you found, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about this disparity in vaccination policies and the harm specifically from not having a national standard.
Absolutely. So I think as we often see, policies across state lines and even across county lines within a state, so if we're talking about jails, those are county level, the policies are always very inconsistent and tend to differ on a lot of key elements, whether it's talking about getting the regular seasonal flu vaccine out, or if it's something more timely, like getting the COVID-19 vaccination out. So we've seen that only about 10 states had incarcerated people specifically identified as part of their first phase of the vaccine rollout. So all the other states either had it sort of ambiguously or in a later stage. And so, you know, our thinking at Prison Policy is that if we're going to be vaccinating people early who are living in congregate housing, living in dense areas, unable to socially distance, like nursing homes or college dorms, then prisons and jails should certainly be up there in that first phase. So initially, we only saw about 10 states identifying them as in that first phase, whereas about 26 states offered vaccinations to corrections staff in the first phase, which I do think was a good plan. I think that they are certainly at high risk as well for working in these environments. But you can see sort of that disparity between like, oh, well, we'll vaccinate the staff and that will somehow create a barrier to protect the incarcerated people instead of us actually just offering them the vaccine early on. And that's something that's been really challenging to follow across the country because it's changing, it's evolving, which is good, but it's also hard to track. So, you know, we are also seeing things sort of changing like this week. So in Cuyahoga County in Ohio, you know, they initially had only 5% of their the people in their jail were vaccinated. And just this week, they start to offer it to everybody in the jail. And we're talking about like mid-May now, like, you know, almost everybody is eligible over the age of 12. So what are we doing just rolling that out? So yeah, those policies have not been very consistent or very structured.
Yeah, Emily, and you obviously mentioned how there's still so many more incarcerated people that need to get vaccinated. So can you just talk about sort of just like the built-in harm inside these institutions when it comes to infectious diseases, especially the coronavirus? Because experts have been warning about this from day one that this was declared a pandemic, but we still let it fester inside many of these institutions. Can you just talk about just some of the inherent problems inside these places?
Absolutely. I think, there's two levels at which I think we can answer that. And the first is sort of historically. And thinking about historically, people in prison are tend to receive inadequate health care to begin with. They're generally in overcrowded facilities where medical staff don't have the time or the capacity to see everybody who's having a medical problem. And that was an issue long before COVID came on the scene. So that's kind of the environment that we've been walking into historically, as well as there have been numerous situations in which incarcerated people have been harmed by either like experimentation or medical testing inside of prisons. So we're looking at a population that's both being harmed by this and also suspicious of the medical system in the facilities that they're in. So then the other part of that is that looking at the people who are incarcerated, as a country, we tend to incarcerate people who are experiencing more chronic illnesses, so both physical and mental illnesses, than we see in the general population. So we've got a particularly vulnerable group of people behind bars in prisons and in jails. In prisons, we're seeing like asthma rates that are almost 2 times higher than in the general population. We're seeing HIV rates that are almost 3 times higher. Heart conditions are also 3 times higher in prisons and jails, and other risk factors, even like cigarette smoking or a history of smoking, is much more prevalent among people who are in prison. So we've got kind of this constellation of health concerns that already exist in this population that are likely not being addressed. And then we're introducing a respiratory virus that's extremely contagious and extremely deadly. So the people that are in there are already at risk. And then they can't even participate in the things that we've sort of established as ways to protect yourself. Social distancing is just not going to be possible across the board in prisons or jails. We're talking about dormitory style housing. We're talking about beds that are 3 feet apart at best. We're talking about, one eating area in the cafeteria. So that's not happening. And then we're also seeing people struggling to get access to the things that they need. And this was something we saw earlier in the pandemic, but difficulty getting access to hand hygiene, rules about alcohol-based hand sanitizers, difficulty getting access to masks because it's a security risk or things like that. So all these things are playing into sort of barriers, I guess, to incarcerated people protecting themselves, but also, surviving this pandemic if they get the virus.
It's incredible. It's a total recipe for disaster, obviously. Emily, I want to go back to the prison guards, right, and the corrections officers, because at the beginning there was this sort of misguided, and obviously it's played out that way, misguided policy of let's vaccinate them, not worry about the prisoners, and that will sort of form some type of health buffer and protect everybody. So if you could just talk a little bit more about that sort of approach, what happened, and where are we at right now in terms of the vaccination rate among prison guards?
Yes. So I think that the initial ideas around vaccinating Department of Corrections staff, prison staff, medical staff, all of those people who are coming in and out of the facility, was based on a couple of factors that had already been sort of in play and then kind of faded out of play during the pandemic. So initially, a lot of states made a move to stop admissions to prison. So instead of letting new folks enter prison, they're kind of keeping them in county jails. So that created problems in county jails. But then you're seeing that in those prisons, the only people exiting and entering are the staff. And so they become sort of unintentionally the people who are carrying that risk of contagion. So once that happened, you can sort of see the logical leap to saying, oh, let's vaccinate the staff first. However, by the time we started vaccinating people, I think every prison system had resumed admissions. So we're no longer like, some confined population. The population is changing. There's people coming in, there's people going out, there's people coming back in. So that's no longer like a feasible plan. So when that changed, I think this vaccination rollout plan should have also changed in those states to say, okay, we need to vaccinate both the staff and the incarcerated folks at the same time. it's been interesting to look at the acceptance rates of the vaccine among correctional staff and also among the incarcerated population. So the median vaccination rate of prison staff across all the states that we could look at, which was about, I think, 36 states in the federal system for staff data, the median was about 48% of staff were receiving that first dose or the Johnson & Johnson 1 dose. So that's like below half. And for a population that we were initially considering to be some sort of protective wall between people behind bars and the general population, that's obviously not going to cut it. That's nowhere near herd immunity, and we don't even know what that's going to be for COVID. So it's just not even close. Some states like Michigan and Alabama have just over 10% of their prison staff vaccinated, and that's pretty frighteningly low. And there were only 4 states that had over 70% of their staff vaccinated. So again, that's good, but the fact that it's only 4 states is pretty frightening. So I think that plan sort of hasn't really played out very well, especially as we continue to see case rates kind of climbing among incarcerated people and impacting staff as well. And continued COVID deaths behind bars in states where, vaccinations have even started in prisons. People are still dying of this disease, which, we could really be reducing the number of people dying by COVID behind bars. We have that ability at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially because people don't realize that this is a virtual death sentence for people who were potentially in prison for a few years or whatever the case may be. Emily, just quickly, the last question that I have is prison policy obviously you guys did a report where you graded each state, and I think most states in the country received a failing grade. How has the vaccine rollout potentially impacted those calculations? I don't know if you've done anything like that yet, if you've updated that report, but I'm just wondering if that's part of your calculation going forward.
Yeah, we haven't updated that report where we sort of divvied out those scores based on how folks in these states were responding to COVID in prison. So we looked at both population reduction as well as some other efforts like getting out PPE, personal protective equipment to staff and incarcerated people, and all sorts of other, criteria that we put into that. I would expect that everybody would score a little bit higher if we kept those same criteria, because things like getting out masks have become a lot more accessible than they were back over the summer. But I think we would have to, as you suggested, incorporate the vaccine rollout. And given the fact that we're still looking at just about half of the incarcerated population is vaccinated, which is, again, a good thing. We're talking about a rate of vaccination that's very similar to the general U.S. population, but to remember that this is a population that is particularly at risk for severe complications from COVID. So you can say, yes, that 50%, 55% is similar to the general U.S. population, but it's still really, really, really dangerous behind bars. There's no socially isolating in your apartment because you're not vaccinated. You can't. You're in prison. So I think if we were to incorporate that, we would have to weigh that a little bit more heavily than some of the other criteria at this point. And I would expect that most states are still doing pretty poorly in addressing this. I mean, it's a population that legislators and officials are often forgetting and often overlooking on purpose. So it's almost impossible to see prisons and jails addressing this in the way that has been recommended by policymakers and and lawyers and attorneys and all those folks on the ground doing the work, and the people behind bars advocating for themselves. So they're just not listening.
Definitely.
To that.
And I think if anybody's watching as opposed to the podcast, you can see that New York State has 27% vaccination rate, and New York was mandated by the court to perform vaccinations. It wasn't even a policy by legislators or the governor. So definitely important information from Emily. Emily, once again, we always appreciate your time, and I just recommend everybody check out prison policy. Sign up for the newsletter, because as a journalist, it's a great resource to have, but also just for the general public, just to stay informed. I definitely suggest you do that. Emily, once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
One time before we go, Emily,
sure.
Manny, thank you for that in-depth breakdown. Obviously, your work is super important, noble, and worthy. One thing, I'm going to take it down to a real everyday person kind of level. Some of us have loved ones that are in prison, right? We have friends, family members, and we know, because from dispatches from the field, as it were, that these conditions exist and that these problems still exist, that the vaccinations haven't rolled out to everybody. I know it seems daunting for a family member or the everyday person to help affect the change. When you said lawyers, policymakers, advocates, organizations are all doing the work to try to make these things better. What can the everyday person, the family member, the regular constituent do to try to affect the changes that are necessary to help our incarcerated population, our friends, families, and neighbors?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think as I normally do, have two answers to that. One is sort of on an individual level. I would really encourage folks who have access to a lot of information about vaccines and the risks and benefits of it, and what it actually entails and all of that. I would really encourage those folks to talk to their loved ones behind bars, because the reality is it's very hard to imagine that public health education is a priority in prisons and jails. We've been hearing stories from people behind bars that there's sometimes a flyer about the J&J vaccine on a table, and then they're asked if they want it, and they say no because they don't know anything about it, or they watched one news episode where it talked about the risks of it. So there's no consistent education. So that would be sort of one thing I would offer as sort of a tangible kind of quick step, would be to just kind of offer some education however you can, whether it's a phone call or an email, or if there's visitation available, to do it that way. I would sort of on a bigger scale, I think that's where it's a little less tangible to think about what kind of changes we can make. I would say that there are a lot of sort of grassroots organizations doing this work in tandem with sort of incarcerated activists about what they specifically need. And I think that varies depending on the facility, depending on the state, depending on where they are with their vaccine rollout. Like I said, there's some states that have done a pretty good job getting vaccines available. So they're going to be having different issues than, say, Utah, that has 7% of their incarcerated population vaccinated. So I would encourage folks who are looking to help their loved ones, their friends and family, to reach out to those local prison rights organizations to see kind of what it is that they're asking for on the ground and how we can sort of support that, whether that's, sending a letter to the warden or sending a letter to the sheriff, or if it's something bigger than that, then, they'll be aware of that on the ground. But I think it's the same thing with the policies. It's so disparate between places that it's hard to know from like a national perspective where to kind of insert ourselves to help support, the people we care about.
No, that's valuable information. I appreciate that. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you,
Emily. Take care. Thank you so much.
All right. Once again, we find out that the answer very often can be local. Can be in your jurisdiction, in your, as a local constituent, as a local person. Like I said, we have loved ones that are in jail. Some of us, and we want to help, but we know that we're just a person linking up with a local organization that's doing the work on the ground in that particular state, for example, could be a way to add fuel to that important fire. So thank you, Emily. Thank you, gentlemen, for conducting a great interview.
All right. We really appreciate Emily. And again, just as I recommend everybody check out Prison Policy. A lot of great information there on the criminal justice system. And speaking of that system, we have our next guest. I think he's ready to go. And that's Daniel Nichanian, the founder and editorial director of the Appeal Political Report. Daniel, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for and it's great to be here after Emily in particular, because as a reporter and editor, PPI's work is always so essential, and their data, their sources, their research to anything we do at the Appeal, and so it's great to be able to be here after her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. I was saying the same thing. That it's an incredible resource to have for anybody. Daniel, we really appreciate you taking your time out tonight, especially in light of last night's Democratic primary in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, concerning the district attorney race there. Can you, just for some of our viewers and listeners who might not be too familiar with the local politics there and Larry Krasner specifically, can you just talk about sort of who he is, the unusual route that he took to become DA, which is already a sort of often obscured role in our politics, and how he sort of rose to fame?
Sure. So it's a very interesting moment right now for DA politics, for criminal justice politics. So just the big picture first for people who may not know who even Larry Krasner is. So in 2017, in the DA race, the race for chief prosecutor in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner won the primary and then the election. And that was very unusual because he had no experience himself as a prosecutor or in law enforcement writ large. His own experience was as a criminal defense attorney and a civil rights attorney. And he really ran, and he actually had already clashed for a long time with law enforcement, had filed lawsuits against law enforcement in Philly. And so his election was really a catalyst for a lot of conversations nationally around the role that prosecutors can play in changing the criminal legal system from the inside. You know, he's not the first person who ran on criminal justice reform in a DA race, but the fact that he was such an outsider to the system, in fact, the fact that he had spent his career fighting the system, kind of changed the expectations of what is even possible to talk about in these elections. And over the past 4 years, Krasner has sort of remained kind of an emblem for the national effort to use DA offices to really change the criminal legal system. Frankly, both for its proponents. I've talked to so many candidates for prosecutor around the country over the past 3 years who have specifically said that Krasner's victory was inspiring to them. A lot of people who aren't prosecutors themselves who pointed to that victory as a reason why they thought it was even a thing for them to run for prosecutor, but also for the opponents of the criminal legal of reform. Bill Barr under the Trump years often pointed to Krasner as an example of the reform movement run amok. A lot of people in the police union, the police union in Philly was very, very hostile to Krasner and fought him for 4 years. And then that brings us to the election this week. To cut a long story short, when Krasner faced a former prosecutor who he himself had fired, effectively as soon as he came into office, Krasner fired some prosecutors, effectively saying your approach, your practices have been too in line with a very punitive approach, and he fired them. And then one of them ran against him this year, Carlos Vega, attracting support from the police union locally, and just a lot of attention nationally, a lot of articles written about whether the progressive movement is running out of breath, stuff like that. And then the result yesterday was that Krasner won with 65% of the vote. So that's kind of the arc of what just happened yesterday. And yeah, it's a big deal for these conversations around criminal justice reform right now.
Thanks, Daniel. And now you and your colleagues have done a great job, really, of detailing why this election is important from a policy perspective. Whether it's dismissing criminal charges for drug possession, reducing the number of people under community supervision, or overturning past criminal convictions. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about these policies in the context of his reelection and to the extent to which his primary opponent wanted to roll them back.
Yeah, that's a particularly great question when it comes to DA elections, because we are not used to talking about the policy that these people implement, right? It's often just about people for a long time just ran on things like I'm going to be fair or I'm going to be tough, and that's kind of the all that we got from prosecutors. And so it's very important for me and for our work at the Appeal to really drill down and explain to people, this is what a prosecutor does, this is what the prosecutor changes. So some of the examples you just mentioned are great examples. So one thing, for instance, that Krasner has done in office is effectively drop almost all a growing share of the charges for drug possession. Effectively, he's saying that drug possession and addiction is not something for the criminal legal system to be involved with, that only makes things worse, that addiction, like bringing addiction into the court system like that is going to make things worse. And the data, we ran a chart of the soaring share of cases dropped for drug possession under Krasner's office. That is really, in and of itself, a telling illustration. I don't have it obviously next to me, but a telling illustration of just what a DA can do. And that's something, for instance, that Carlos Vega was talking about, using other ways of avoiding jail time or prison time and putting people in what's called drug courts, which are still a form of prosecution. But that was a form of contrast, for instance, that came up. Another form of contrast that came up was that DAs can protect immigrants from various sorts of immigration consequences. When someone who's not a citizen comes into contact with law enforcement or the court system, that can have very, very bad consequences for their immigration status if they're legal, and for their deportation if they're not. And Krasner had created an office within the DA's office to find ways to charge people or sentence people in a way that would circumvent the immigration consequences, right? So those are specific examples of the sort of powers these judges have. Obviously, then we can talk about seeking lower sentences, seeking lower bail for people to avoid pretrial detention, all sorts of things. And Vega's argument really was Krasner's attempts to lower incarceration were going to harm the city. That was effectively a tougher on crime argument. Though, and I will end here, what's interesting in the election, really, I think, is that Vega, in some ways, was not fully embracing that old school tough on crime message. He was running with the support of the police union, and he was having all this like national coverage of whether reform versus tough on crime is more appropriate. But in a lot of the things he said, he wasn't fully embracing the idea that he wanted to reverse Krasner's policies, as though the movement has come so far, the conversation has come so far that we're no longer in 2017 or in 2013, and those same arguments will no longer hold sway.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm glad you mentioned that. Just, I don't think you can underscore enough or exaggerate the role that the union played in trying to knock out Krasner in the primary. They even did some gimmicky stuff that I think people chuckled at, like the Mr. Softy thing outside his office, right? But it's interesting, as you just mentioned, this is another Democrat that they were supporting, that potentially, if it's Democrat-Republican, they might pull their endorsement just because of the actual policies that are more aligned with this 2021 version of criminal justice. So just from the political aspect, I don't know what observers are saying, but do they see as the police union's power sort of diminished in selecting candidates and effectively, making them the DA? Because a lot of times, historically, that's what would happen. But that may have been impacted by a lot of these progressive prosecutors running. What do you think about that?
I mean, listen, on the one hand, we have obviously come to a point where it's become obvious that a lot of arguments that 4 years ago would have seemed like non-starters in elections are actually very successful. We've seen that, and I think that's what's important to add to the context that I've said so far, especially for people who haven't followed this movement very closely.
Right.
That in the time between 2017, Krasner's first election, and today, it's been a sea change around the country. Just over the past couple of years, people who have won on platforms similar to Krasner include places like LA, places like New Orleans, Ann Arbor, parts of Arizona and Virginia, parts of Massachusetts, a lot of different cities, a lot of suburban areas. And so the context has changed a lot, right? On the other hand, we are still in a place where the mere fact that the police union is attacking someone, the mere fact that prosecutors within a DA's office is attacking the elected prosecutor is in and of itself enough to generate a wave of coverage that talks about the anxieties of towards criminal justice reform, as though we were still in the 80s, and that's also a reality. Like we really are seeing that right now in LA, where George Gascon, who's the elected DA of LA, who just won in November, ousting the incumbent DA there in November, on a platform that's broadly speaking, let's say similar to Krasner's, if not on some aspects goes further. He has faced a lot of resistance from people who were already in the office. And if you look at the media coverage in LA, there's this like drip. There's this drip of ADAs, assistant prosecutors, people in the sheriff department, who are getting emotional in interviews with the media about the fact that they're no longer able to seek as high sentences or as high bail. And that in and of itself is a story, right? This prosecutor who is getting teary about not being able to seek the death penalty in a case. So that in and of itself is still there. And the expectation that Krasner would get more trouble than he ended up getting in the primary is indicative of that, perhaps.
Right. And Daniel, since this was such an issue, I mean, just overall, and affected so many people, and obviously in the election, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the homicide spike in 2020, right? So obviously opponents are going to blame that on progressive prosecutors, but what do the criminologists say about this, or what does the data point to so far? I know it's very early.
Yeah, I think this is going to not be an answer that is still very satisfying, but the answer seems to be that it's, as often with things that involve the crime rate going up or down, that there are no easy answers, and that studies are not very clear about what is behind it. What is clear in many ways is that the spike in violence and crime is impacting cities around the country, whether or not they're being governed by one of the DAs that I just mentioned, including in the few cities. I saw some statistics last week. There's only a few cities that have Republicans at the head, but those also have experienced a spike in crime. But I think what's and obviously this was a major issue in the Philly DA race, and will continue to be an issue in all these elections, as it should be. Very important things to talk about, obviously. But I think what's important, I think some of where the conversation doesn't really quite make sense how it's happening is that the conversation, sometimes it looks as though people think that criminal justice reform, that people only argue for criminal justice reform when crime is low. When a lot of the argument for reform, for abolition, for wherever you are on that spectrum, is that the conventional approaches to incarceration and policing have failed at creating a safe society, right? And so it's not that criminal justice reformers are throwing their hands in the air and are saying, "Oh, the crime is spiking, so it's no longer our turn." On the contrary, a lot of the argument for people like Krasner right now is that it's mass incarceration, the way in which that has impoverished entire communities, that has put people in great straits. That all of that has something to do with how we think about safety as well. I mean, for instance, at some point, one of you mentioned probation rates in Philly, and that's a very important thing to think about, because Philly has one of the highest rates of probation in the country. So that means people who aren't in prison, so we don't really count them as incarcerated. Well, they're not. They shouldn't be counted as incarcerated, but yet they're under extreme amounts of supervision, and at the slightest trip up, they can be sent back to jail. So, right, those sort of approaches to how we think about crime and safety, the argument goes to people like Krasner, are part of what has caused American society to be broken in many ways. So I think that's what's playing out right now. It's not an argument of whether, it's an argument of what is the best solution to these problems of violence, right? And Krasner got 85% yesterday in, for instance, in Philadelphia's Black wards. He got support kind of in a lot of the cities. So that's important to think about in terms of who is supporting him and what sort of arguments are resonating.
I really appreciate that answer, Daniel, because just a lot of people sometimes when they're reading about crime stats, it's often missing the context and how difficult it is to actually give a reason why stats are going up or down or whatever. So really appreciate that. Just a last question, because I know we're going over. We obviously, Chris mentioned a lot of the policies that Krasner has enacted during his time as DA. What has he promised going forward?
Yeah, I think another, I'm not necessarily aware of things he has promised that are necessarily different than what he's doing. I think an interesting way of thinking about it is that there's a lot of space to his left, right? It's not, I think the way in which this ends up being covered is that there's Krasner, the radical DA, and then there's like the police union and conservative and the Trump administration and Bill Barr are attacking him, and so that's how I presented it as well, right? But if you look at how the very community organizations and grassroots groups like Reclaim Philly, the Abolitionist Law Center, a lot of groups are based in Philly and are very active. The Bell Fund in Philly, a lot of the groups that were very active in making the case that his policies are important to keep going forward have also been critics of his in many ways over the past few years, saying that he hasn't gone far enough in cutting pretrial detention, for instance, saying he hasn't gone far enough in protecting all immigrants from deportation. That's something I was talking about earlier as something he is extending to some defendants, but not all. Also, I mean, on probation, there's a lot of room to go further if you're talking about criminal justice reform. And what we're seeing around the country right now is many prosecutors who, in part inspired by Larry Krasner, have run on platforms that go beyond what he has proposed, right? In New York City has a DA race in a month, and many of the candidates there are effectively have proposed lists of low-level offenses that they will that they won't charge at all, that they will not prosecute at all. So there's a lot of different things that are happening around the country that are changing the conversation. And I don't want to say that I've left Krasner behind, because that's not quite the right way to say it, but that have opened a lot of space to his left to have more conversations over the next 4 years. And I will add one thing, which is that Progressive actually had we've been focused on the DA race here, but Progressives had very good nights in Philly in other races as well, especially, which is very relevant here, elections for local judge. And I mentioned that because judges in Philly, in some cases, have blocked some of the proposals, some of the efforts by Krasner to lower bail or sentences in some cases, and groups and progressive groups in Philly were really focused this year on judge elections and endorsed a bunch of candidates, and 7 of the 8 candidates for local judge that they endorsed won yesterday as well. So that could also maybe change the dynamic, the system, the structure that Krasner is in, because it's not really about what he himself is doing, right? It's about the system is in and what different parts of the system are doing to one another. And there's new opportunities for that conversation over the next 4 years.
Great. Thanks for bringing that up, because that's another aspect, obviously, that's overlooked when we talk about criminal justice and elections. Daniel, we really appreciate your insights. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And just like we did with prison policy, we recommend everybody check out The Appeal. Your entire team does magnificent work over there, actually covering the policies. So we really appreciate your insights, and thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much.
All right, there it is. Yeah, theappeal.org is where you got to go. So get on it, people.
All right. We got 2 interesting conversations back to back. Just
incredible.
We threw a lot at people.
This is, to me, as I mentioned before, the focus on local elections, that all politics are local, but that you can make change that's significant by paying attention to your local elections, local DAs, local judges. It's not just that every 4-year cycle for the regular everyday poll. I've been guilty of it throughout my life, so I know that others are as well. This conversation emphasizes how important, if you're interested in these ideas, these reforms, these progressive ideas, that local elections are extremely important, and we will continue to follow them. We covered this a couple of, I don't know how long ago, but a while ago. Tee up the Law and Order episode.
Oh yeah. So man, I don't even remember. This is when Chase Abedin, I think, was running, or this was right before.
Yeah.
So it was a couple of years ago. So yeah, we covered sort of. This was basically. This was maybe, I guess.
I like to brag and tell people that we were way ahead of all this conversation years ago. So it's fine that it's
Well,
old.
I think we got there
we
just
sort of
as
were.
the progressive prosecutor thing was coming to life, right? And it's actually, we were so early that some of them don't even like to be called progressive prosecutors. They like to be called reform prosecutors. But obviously that happened after we started covering it. But basically we were just giving people an overview of district attorneys, as Daniel was talking about, just the importance of focusing on those elections, because oftentimes, and this is mentioned in that episode, and I actually urge everybody to check it out, it's the idea that DAs are often reelected without even having an opponent. So you'll have some DAs who are in office for like 2 decades, 3 decades, never actually having a challenger. And obviously, one more thing before you play the clip is that a lot of DAs historically have been white men, so they didn't represent the city or the community that they were in charge of.
I don't have a clip.
Oh, you don't have a clip. Okay. So just tell everybody to go. We could, no. We'll just drop a link in there and let everybody go listen to the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah. So just reminding people that we are a podcast that covers a lot of these topics, sort of in a documentary fact. I'm just going to play a little bit. This is what a Newsbeat episode sounds like. Just a snippet.
Black chief executive.
Most people that are in jail are at the county or local level. So that's why it's so necessary to not only elect prosecutors who share a reformist mindset, but to also elect mayors and sheriffs and city council members, as well as folks in the state government who actually share our values on criminal justice reform. We want to move away from this dated model of a prosecutor who goes on and gets elected by spouting tough on crime rhetoric. And we want folks who have a sensible approach to criminal justice reform that helps people move through a system and out of a system into a society that will allow them to be their best selves.
Let me state it plain and simple. Whatever booth I may get into, it's basically the same principles. Study the issues, plus I listen to my heart. So recording booth, the voting booth, it's all the same start. That mean the same foundation, the same driving force. I kinda thought that should be common and widely taught, but I guess it's not though. Just look inside the courts. If that's a microcosm, you know we out of sorts. That's our collective moral compass. But when it seems to not function, it's like we barely even seem to budget. No one opposes. It's like we incumbents. A lot of people don't know we could do something. Like I could talk about injustice, but you know the problems and the fixes. You injustice. If we can't trust the ones that's in power, then maybe we could rally the troops and vote them out of it.
My name is Mark.
Woo! Fire, more fire, all the fire.
Sage tells me that was October 2018, and it makes sense because Silent Night sounds like a younger man in that verse.
Silent Night has aged tremendously during the pandemic.
I think we've stressed him out with all our content. I think
if you listen to the most recent episode, he sounds like Marge Simpson. It's crazy. I'm Silent Night. You heard me in it. And I'm like, that's USK? Yeah, it's me. It's the same guy from before when I did the episode. It's hit him hard. We love him. Shouts to our artists in residence. Look, you saw Silent Night, ripping and rocking. That's how Newsbeat does. We interview the activists, the experts, the analysts, the academics, the authors, the journalists, and those affected by injustice directly. We throw it over we smack it, flip it, rub it down all over a bed of music. And then periodically throughout the episodes, we hear from brilliant independent artists like Silent Night, our artists in residence, who personify and amplify and smack an exclamation point on the issues by compellingly translating it to hip-hop lyrical form. It makes for an incredibly compelling, award-winning, if you didn't know, now you know, podcast called Newsbeat. So if you're watching us on the video tip, please do subscribe to Newsbeat wherever you find podcasts, or go to usnewsbeat.com. Links are there. But that was our introduction to the topic. I found it very interesting as a layman, someone who just, pays attention to politics pretty intensely, but forgetting, I'm guilty of it like y'all are, do not forget that the way to make change effectively in criminal justice reform and some of these issues can start with your local elections. DAs, as you mentioned, are elected locally. They often run without opposition. But you know what? You could back somebody to oppose them. There are organizations in your city, town, county, government, whatever, legislation, where they're trying to make these changes happen. Look into them, find them, seek them out, throw your weight as a grown-up, as a citizen, as an adult. Let's do some adulting and get involved with the political system on a local basis. Things can happen as we have seen. So,
and also just on top of that, it's also maintaining the pressure too. So you elect somebody like Larry Krasner, Chesa Boudin, we mentioned, Wesley Morris, and now we're seeing, as Daniel mentioned, that there's efforts to sort of take away some of their powers, which DAs previously never really complained about. You know, these tough on crime DAs loved having all the power, but now they want to strip people like George Gascon in LA of certain powers to prevent them from carrying out his agenda. We also see in San Francisco efforts to recall Chesa Boudin, right? So it's also staying engaged after the fact to make sure that you don't lose sight of what's going to happen. I think we've said it on this show before in a news beat that it's a lot of work just to get some of these minor policies passed with regards to criminal justice. So by, ignoring it, by, getting your preferred candidate elected, and then potentially you're tired, you're exhausted from all the fighting. And that's understandable. And we all get it, but that's the, you got to keep up the pressure. And I think that's apparent with what happened in Philly, where you had Larry Krasner winning his primary overwhelmingly.
Yeah. Well, we'll genius minds think alike. We'll see what happens with that. I need to alert our live audience and of course our podcast listening audience that a very disheartening thing has happened here in the studio. We're very sad to report that Chris T has disappeared. Now, this is really, that's the comment we're going to show. Well, listen, you know what I say? So, and of course we're showing us a comment that's a bot, clearly a bot. So, you're famous when the bots start jumping in on your stream. Maybe save that screenshot because we don't know what happened to Chris. Now, this is what's crazy. Our next segment, Deadass, we're going to talk about UFOs. Now, it's not just a casual conversation amongst friends, us and y'all, but there's a social justice component in some ways to the UFOs. And y'all might have seen 60 Minutes this week, and there was a thing, and there's a thing coming next month. There's a whole bunch of things happening about UFOs. Some of that is tied to government relief for the COVID pandemic. There's a whole thing going on. And Chris, because we love Chris for some of the work he does in a realm of reality that we're not always dancing in.
I mean, it's not, I don't even know if you call it a realm.
I don't know
what it is.
His expertise is in some of these fringe, quote unquote, but also the TV show, scientific, unknown parallels, things that are happening in and out of our direct eyesight, and UFOs or UAPs, as they're often known, was one of them. And we were going to discuss it. And then suddenly, Chris,
what are the chances minutes before, like seconds before, you're about to throw it to him?
I mean,
can we get him on the phone? What can we do? I mean, you're the producer. I don't know. Can we get him on the?
I might be
able
on
the Uber conference.
Yeah, I mean, you want to try to set it up because this is not a bit. We're not. He disappeared.
Wow, this is not a. It's not that we don't know what happened to him, why his connection was cut. We don't know where he is.
We don't know what happened to him. He literally
we could try to call him, but we otherwise don't have any contact with Chris.
I know we're out of control right now, but Chris Tawarski, we don't know where you are, Ski. Listen, you are live on This Week in Social Justice. We've patched you in. Yeah, we are live. We patched you in via the satellite phone. Yeah, I got you. We patched you in, bro. I got the bat phone.
I can't hear him. I can't hear him.
Hold on. Oh, okay. I can hear you. Can you hear me? How about now? Yeah. Can you hear me? We are live. Rashad, can you hear him?
I can't hear Chris. I can only hear you. The tech wizardry, the whoever has taken Chris is preventing him from being broadcasted.
He ran through the window, and there was a flash of light.
All right, we'll save it for the next show. I think it's a good tease for next week.
We'll save it for the next show. There is a social justice and or government political connection with UFOs. It's important. It's a great topic. I'm really upset we couldn't get into it tonight. But that is what happens.
Obviously.
They're trying to get us.
They're always watching. And we don't know who they is. Obviously, the government, other powers that be.
Yeah.
All right, so let's do it for next show. It's all good. I think we have enough time until this famed report is going to come out. I don't know if it's going to be everything's going to be redacted except for the letters ET.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is there is a bit of money that was put aside in the COVID relief package to look at whether or not, essentially, I mean, this is super simplified, whether UFOs are real. Now, you might have seen 60 Minutes last Sunday posed this line of questioning. They talked to military officials that have reported and seen, anomalies. They've showed video. There's some clips. There's some things that are happening. This is nothing new. This has been happening for decades and decades. What's new is that they are incorporating this into a report that was commissioned to find out whether there's actually some credence to this, which is, I think, coming out in June. Chris, I hear you. Is that correct?
I love Chris is just in your ear. He's just gonna take over he's gonna take over your body.
He says, is this a coincidence? It's really weird. We were planning this whole discussion, but we will find Chris. We will protect him. We will protect Chris at all costs and come back next week on This Week in Social Justice to talk about the connection of UFOs/UAPs to the COVID relief fund. And we will then be a step closer to finding out if indeed.
That's interesting. I think Sage thinks Chris was taken to Camp Hero.
It's your man, Manny Faces, your man, Rashad Mian, and the somewhere Chris Tawarski from Newsbeat and This Week in Social Justice. This is what we brought to you tonight. Thank you to our amazing guests who we had on tonight discussing Emily Widra, research analyst at Prison Policy Initiative, who broke down the tragic story. We're joking now, but obviously it was serious earlier and it remains serious. The issue of our incarcerated brethren and sistren facing increased exposure and sickness and death due to COVID, yet not receiving the same attention that other populations, including our nursing homes and our elderly, when it comes to vaccinations and protections. We spoke about, like I said, I have family members that are in prison right now that are literally saying, hey, we're dying in here. What can we do? Her advice, find your local grassroots on the ground prison initiative, just like the Prison Policy Initiative is sort of an overarching look. There are local organizations that can help that issue. Daniel Nichanian.
Yep.
Director of The Appeal Political Report, a great website, theappeal.org, breaking down all of the ramifications, ins and outs, inside and outside of progressive or reform district attorney races, including the well-known and well-publicized Philadelphia race. So if you're just catching at the end, rewind and come again, go back to the beginning. You can also find this on our podcast feed. We are at usnewsbeat.com to get the links, but we're wherever you find podcasts, we're there. Two words, one love. Newsbeat by Maury Creative Studios. Shouts to Maury Creative Studios and the Many Faces Media teams who help put the podcasts and this broadcast together. We'll be back probably next week with all likelihood. I have a granddaughter that is on the precipice of entering the world, so I don't quite know when I'm going to be here or there, but I'm just sharing that with y'all because you love us as people, not just presenters of interesting information. Rashad, anything else? Am I forgetting? Should I?
Somehow we failed to mention that the Knicks are the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference.
Obviously, we're saving the best for last. New York. Go
Tuesday,
New York.
I'll be at game 2, so there's no telling if I'll be back for Wednesday's show. I guess I could do it from wherever Chris is if they could find me.
Nice.
And,
I'll
teleport
be.
me.
Hold on. The pyramids of Mars have great reception. This is what I'm hearing from Chris. I'll be in Atlanta visiting my newly birthed grandchild during the first couple of games. So I will be probably getting it. I'm just saying it's probably going to happen.
It's amazing how that works out too.
It's really crazy, right? So anyway, yes, go New York, go New York, go. Wearing my Knicks colors. Shouts to homeboy Sandman, even though they're Mets colors, but they're also Knicks colors. I'm wearing his hat. And that's it. We're out of here for the day. Shouts to Kitty Bradshaw rocking with us. Shouts to my man Coleman. I love you, brother. Keep your head up. We're working for you. Shouts to Dr. Raphael Travis in the mix watching us tonight. Shouts to Sage on the back end helping us out. Shouts to, again, Maury Creative Studios, Many Faces Media, everybody who helps put the podcast and the show together. Find out more about us, usnewsbeat.com. You'll get our regular episodes. You'll get our kind of Cinco de Mayo episode, which was a departure from what we do. We are bringing you truth, justice, and the
American dream. I don't know.
Say. So shouts to Chris Jaworski. I hope you are not sitting in a bathtub somewhere filled with ice cubes with one kidney missing. I did it voluntarily. I hope that you have not been taken and you're being probed right now. We'll come back next week and talk about social justice and, again, UFOs. Who else does that? Newsbeat. This week is social justice. You man, Many Faces. We're out. Peace and love.